This is the Agribusiness Report. I'm Tony St. James. We're joined today by Randy Blach. Randy's with CattleFax, and Randy, we're here in the Metroplex for Texas Cattle Feeders Association's annual meeting. So how big is TCFA when it comes to the overall industry?
Oh, the Texas cattle feeding industry is year in and year out, it's one of the top three feeding industries in the United States. Typically, Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska are the top three, and that hasn't changed for the last 30 years. So, obviously, very important from a feeding industry standpoint, producing high-quality fed beef, but also the largest cow-calf state in the nation. So, this is the heartbeat of the U.S. cattle industry when we get into the central southern plains region, and Texas is the leader.
You know, that's really changed over time. That was one of the points you brought out today, is using the dairy industry today as an example, but also you could reflect back on how other segments of the industry have changed as well. Tie that together for us.
Well, I think all this goes back to the development of the Ogallala Aquifer. When we started figuring out we could grow more grain in the Central Plains, and again that goes from Nebraska through northeast Colorado or eastern Colorado on through western Kansas and on into the Texas Panhandle region. Along with the development of Ogallala Aquifer, we could grow more feed. Thus, the cattle feeding industry ended up really developing in that region in the late 1960s and especially in the 1970s as we went through the growth. Prior to that time period, the cattle feeding industry was more heavily located along the rivers. Again, if you think back to the old terminal markets, Denver, Kansas City, Sioux Falls, Sioux City, Omaha, Chicago stockyards, all of those areas. So more of the cattle were fed in the northern plains where the grain was, but most of the trade was along the rivers. So that's where the feeding industry was early on, back in the 50s and 60s, and it started to migrate out of those regions mainly in the 60s and into the 70s. So today the feeding industry is more heavily located in a 5-state area: Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Oklahoma. So that 5-state area would typically represent about 75% of the nation's fed cattle. That was a long answer. Tony.
But that sets us up for the next one. About 10 years ago, we had a drought across the southern high plains, and with that, one of the beef packers closed a plant in Plainview. And it seems as though maybe things changed from that point forward. But when you look at where we are, if the industry is a pie, and sometimes certain segments get a larger piece of the pie, where would you put the pie today, and how would that compare, maybe not to 10 years ago, but maybe to the pandemic?
Well, I think, Tony, we need to go back a little bit further than that. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than losing one packing plant. If you go back to where the industry was, I think this is important for all the listeners out here, is remember our largest fed cattle harvest in history happened in 2000. We harvested 30 million head of fed cattle, high quality fed cattle in 2000. And we had adequate packing capacity to harvest that many cattle at that time period. In fact, we've never had a time in the history of our industry until 2016 where we actually had more cattle than what we had hooks. Now that may happen if we got a big front end supply, but in general, that had never happened until 2016. So there was a whole host of plants. Plainview is one of numerous. We lost a half a dozen plants in there from 2005 to 2014. We lost a half a dozen major plants, and in fact we lost about 100,000 head of harvest capacity, 100,000 head a week of harvest capacity in our fed cattle plants from where we were back in 2000 to where we finished in 2015. So by the time we got to 2015, we only had enough cattle to harvest 23 million cattle. So remember what I said, in 2000 we could harvest 30 million. That means there's 7 million fewer cattle to harvest. You're going to close packing plants. I mean, those plants went out of business. There wasn't enough supply.
Now, we saw some shifts over the last few years and some concerns. We've opened up some more rail space, if you will, rack space. But as we move forward, where do you see us going as an industry? I mean, obviously we've seen a culling due to drought conditions over the last 18 months.
Well, we're going through another downsizing in here because of drought, very similar to what we did a decade ago when we went through that drought. And again, this has been a 25-year drought cycle. We've had a few years of reprieve within it, but it's really been a prolonged 25-year drought cycle. We're coming out of that 25-year drought cycle, moving back into a weather pattern as we look at this with what our long-range weather forecasters are telling us. So in general, we're going to see more favorable conditions over the next decade, I think it's fair to say, than what we've seen in general over the last 2 decades. So as we go through this, again, we're dealing with a smaller supply into 2025, maybe into 2026. So fewer animals to harvest, there will be more hooks than there is cattle. Thus, a leverage shift. Again, we went through a period in here, we had more cattle than we had hooks to harvest them. Now we're going to have more hooks than we have cattle to fill them. So that's the leverage shift we're going through. We will get to a spot over the next few years where it's going to get very, very tight for the packing industry, just because of where we are within the cattle cycle. So the worst of that's probably going to be 2025, 2026.
Now, kind of coming back to this meeting, for feeders, they've seen a lot of red in the past. Are you seeing a few smiles today? Are we back to where we can safely say that the feeders are in the black, at least for a little while?
Well, we've seen a nice recovery in the feeding industry. 2023 will be the second largest feeding profits that I can measure in my 43-year history in the industry. This will be the second best feeding profit year in the history of our industry, second only to 2014. So yes, we're finally seeing some profitability. We've seen that now for about 15 months in the feeding industry. Our stocker growers, the producers that are putting weight on cattle, putting 300 to 400 pounds on them, those folks are profitable. Our cow-calf producers, what we look at is these are the people that run the factory. I mean, we have to have those cow-calf producers. They haven't been profitable for 6 to 7 years. They're finally profitable. And they're really the ones that are so critical because they do control the supply. So getting those folks profitable, we need better moisture conditions yet through a number of these southern plains regions, and we need more water. We need more drinking water for the livestock. So we've got our fingers crossed that we're going to see that change and get more favorable in here this fall and winter.
I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here, looking at some auction markets and hearing some reports back from them, seeing really good and high demand for those pairs coming through. Is it safe to say that could be an indicator of restocking starting to come, or is that just part of the market we're in today?
Well, we're definitely seeing some restocking in some areas. I'd say more so in the northern half of the Central Plains and the west. we're definitely seeing some restocking. We're seeing some rebuilding take place in those areas. I'd say it's less so in the Southern Plains region and the Southeast. We're not seeing as much of that in those areas yet. There's some going on, don't get me wrong. There's some going on, but there's too much area that's still plagued with a lack of feed resources or a lack of water or not enough hay. So it's a combination of all three of those things, but herd rebuilding will come when Mother Nature tells us it's time.
Okay, we'll wrap it up with the fact you're with CattleFax. Many in the industry are very familiar with CattleFax, but for those who aren't, kind of the elevator speech about CattleFax and how do we get involved?
Well, CattleFax has been around now for more than 55 years. So we were started in 1968 by the small group in the cattle industry said, hey, we need our own industry databases. We need to have our own independent voice, our own independent databases to where we can cross-check some of the information. So that's where it got started by a few leaders within the industry, and we've been fortunate enough to carry out that mission now for years. We serve all segments of producers, from seed stock to cow-calf, stockers, backgrounders, feeders of all size, animal health companies, feed companies, need information. They need to know where the trends are as well. So that's who we are and what we do. We spend a tremendous amount of time measuring supply, demand, trade, imports, exports, and forecasting these markets. Is there going to be some opportunities? Do we need to be managing more risk? All of those type of things. So if you're interested and you're looking for a source for that type of information, go on the website and it's www.cattlefax.com. I think you'll be very pleased what you find.
Randy, so good to see you. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Appreciate it a bunch.
Again, it's the President and CEO of CattleFax, Randy Blach, from the Texas Cattle Feeders Association's annual convention in Grapevine, Texas. I'm Tony St. James. It's the Agribusiness Report.